Brazil and China also agreed on upholding multilateralism through the Group of 20 and BRICS. Now, according to Chinese media, Xi called for coordinated efforts against unilateralism and protectionism in the face of global economic uncertainty.
Minutes before tariffs were set to explode to record highs, Washington and Beijing froze. A 90-day lifeline was thrown to the world's two biggest economies. No deal, no peace, just time and a dangerous game that could reset the balance of global power. The last-minute call. Late on the evening of August 11th, President Donald Trump signed an executive order delaying a planned hike in import duties on Chinese goods until November 10th. It was a narrow escape without the extension. Planned tariffs on Chinese imports were set to surge to 145%, with Beijing ready to hit back with proposed 125% duties on American exports. Such rates, according to U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, would have effectively amounted to a trade embargo between the two nations. Trump's decision came after weeks of speculation about whether the truce, first agreed in May, would hold. Speaking on his Truth Social platform, Trump reportedly said he had instructed my team to hold fire on the higher duties because China had taken significant steps toward addressing non-reciprocal trade arrangements. For Beijing, the delay was also a relief. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce confirmed it would match the U.S. pause, holding its tariff rate at 10% for U.S. goods instead of the triple-digit hike it had prepared. Officials in Beijing called the decision a step toward win-win cooperation and urged Washington to lift what they called unreasonable trade restrictions, particularly those affecting advanced technology and semiconductor production. How we got here. The trade war's latest chapter began in April, when the U.S. imposed sweeping new tariffs on dozens of countries, with China facing some of the steepest penalties. Beijing retaliated almost immediately, triggering a tit-for-tat escalation that sent tariff rates soaring and trade volumes plunging. At the peak of the confrontation, tariffs reached into the triple digits, slowing shipments to a trickle and forcing companies on both sides to scramble for alternative markets. In May, after talks in Geneva, Washington and Beijing agreed to a partial thaw. U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods were cut to 30%, and China's duties on American exports dropped to 10%. The deal included specific concessions. Washington would lift some restrictions on chip-making technology and ethane sales, while Beijing pledged to ease access to its rare earth minerals for U.S. firms. But the agreement was always more of a ceasefire than a peace treaty. Washington continued to press China on issues like intellectual property protections and state subsidies for industry, while Beijing sought greater access to U.S. high-tech exports. Both sides held firm on their core positions, setting the stage for another confrontation when the 90-day extension expired in August. The stakes for business. For American companies, the uncertainty has been as damaging as the tariffs themselves. Beth Benoik, founder of baby products company Busy Baby, told BBC Radio 4 that the constant back and forth makes it impossible to plan. Since I have no idea what the tariff is actually going to end up being, I have no control or idea about the pricing that's going to work for my business, she said.
Leaders agreed to enhance cooperation in trade, energy, defense, and other areas as U.S. tariffs on Brazilian goods jumped 50%. Putin also dialed his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping to update him on the latest US-Russia talks on the war in Ukraine. According to reports, Xi Jinping expressed support for a long-term solution to the conflict. Ahead of the phone call, China slammed Trump's steep tariffs on India over Russian oil purchase, calling it a clear case of tariff abuse while urging restraint.
The stakes are especially high now because the U.S. retail sector is heading into its crucial holiday season. Imports of electronics, apparel, and toys typically surge in the final months of the year. If the tariff hike had gone ahead, those goods would have been subject to far higher duties costs that would almost certainly have been passed on to consumers. The 90-day reprieve means that, at least for this holiday season, imports will arrive under the current rates. Agriculture. One of Trump's more specific demands has been that China quadruple its purchases of U.S. soybeans. These imports have collapsed in recent years under the weight of the tariffs, dealing a blow to American farmers. But analysts have questioned whether such a dramatic increase is even feasible, given global demand patterns and China's own agricultural priorities. Beijing has so far avoided committing to the scale Trump wants. Chinese officials argue that any increase in imports must be matched by U.S. flexibility in other areas, particularly technology exports. Technology. While agriculture is politically sensitive, technology is strategically vital. Washington has placed strict controls on the sale of advanced chips to China, citing national security concerns. Recently, however, the Trump administration allowed companies like AMD and Nvidia to resume sales of certain chips on the condition that they hand over 15% of revenues from those sales to the U.S. government, according to industry observers. The unusual arrangement has been described as unprecedented by some analysts, with critics calling it a shakedown. Beijing has also used its leverage, particularly its control over rare earth minerals, which are critical to high-tech manufacturing. Shifting trade flows. Even under the current truce, trade volumes have fallen sharply. According to U.S. government data, imports from China in June were nearly half their level from the same month in 2024. For the first 6 months of 2025, the U.S. imported $165 billion worth of goods from China, a 15% drop compared to the previous year. American exports to China fell roughly 20% over the same period. Chinese trade data paints a similar picture. Exports to the U.S. fell 21.7% in July compared to a year earlier. At the same time, China's exports to Southeast Asia rose 16.6% as manufacturers sought to pivot toward markets less affected by U.S. tariffs. Some of that trade has been routed indirectly to the U.S. through transshipment arrangements, taking advantage of separate trade rules in the region.
South Korea and Taiwan are now looking for alternatives, and China is getting the opportunity to accelerate the growth of its own chip industry. So let's break it down. Donald Trump has opened a new conflict, and this time, it's not with China and not with the Democrats. His target is the entire BRICS alliance, with India unexpectedly first in line. He has threatened to impose tariffs of 50% on Indian goods because of India's increasingly close trade with Russia and deeper involvement in BRICS affairs. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, India has been buying cheap Russian oil.
The shifts have also narrowed the U.S. trade deficit with China to its lowest level in more than 2 decades. But analysts caution that this is not necessarily a sign of a healthier trade relationship. It may simply reflect reduced trade overall rather than more balanced trade, the BRICS Factor. The China tariff delay comes at a time when Washington's trade disputes are expanding beyond Beijing. Trump has imposed steep tariffs on other major economies, including a 50% levy on Indian imports over New Delhi's continued purchases of Russian oil. Just hours before announcing the China extension, the U.S. slapped the same 50% tariff on Brazilian exports. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva moved quickly to shore up alliances. On August 12th, he spoke by phone with Xi Jinping in a coordinated show of unity. Both leaders vowed to resist unilateralism and protectionism, and to deepen their economic cooperation through the BRICS bloc, which also includes India, Russia, and South Africa. However, not all BRICS members always align perfectly on trade strategy, with differences in priorities sometimes surfacing during negotiations. In the days leading up to the call, Lula met with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Russian President Vladimir Putin to coordinate their positions in response to U.S. trade measures. These meetings underscore how the BRICS nations are increasingly using trade disputes with Washington as a rallying point for closer economic integration. COP30 as a strategic stage. Later this year, Brazil will host COP30, the United Nations Climate Summit. While its official focus is on environmental policy, BRICS leaders see the event as a high-profile opportunity to strengthen their economic and political ties. Xi has confirmed that China will send a senior delegation to the summit. According to Chinese officials, the group will work on advancing cooperation not just in climate-related areas, but also in health, energy, the digital economy, and satellite technology. For BRICS, COP30 is becoming a stage to showcase alternatives to the US-led economic order and to demonstrate that its members can coordinate on a global platform. Markets respond. Financial markets reacted positively to the truce extension. Asian stocks rose, and regional currencies stabilized after weeks of uncertainty. Trump told CNBC that the US and China were getting very close to a trade agreement and suggested he could meet Xi before the end of the year if a deal is struck. But the optimism is tempered by caution. Analysts like Xu Tianchen of the Economist Intelligence Unit note that both sides still believe they can absorb the economic pressure, meaning the game and confrontation could resume at any time. Washington's refusal to ease certain tariffs, such as the 20% duty linked to fentanyl flows, suggests there are limits to how far the U.S. will compromise. The 90-day pause is just that, a pause. By November 10th, if no broader deal has been reached, both countries could face the same cliff edge they just avoided. With global supply chains still recovering from past disruptions, another tariff spike would ripple far beyond US and Chinese borders. The US-China truce is not happening in isolation. It is part of a larger recalibration of global trade relationships, in which Washington is using tariffs not just as an economic tool, but as a lever of geopolitical influence. At the same time, BRICS is positioning itself as a counterweight to Western-led systems, with its members deepening ties in ways that could reshape trade flows for decades. As the world waits for the next move, one question looms. Is this 90-day extension a bridge to a breakthrough, or just the latest in a series of temporary fixes? What's your take on the truce? Is it a smart strategic pause? Let us know in the comments.